So we have noon right now. We have about 13 participants. Let's give it one more minute to have a few folks log in before we begin. Thank you. All right, we have 12:01. We're going to get started. So good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Gatwiri Muthara, Membership and Communications Manager for COMTO National. I'd like to thank you for joining us for our webinar today, Leading Effectively Through a Crisis. But before we start, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping rules. So first, I'd like to ask you to please mute your audio or phone when you're not speaking. Please turn off your camera so we can focus on the presenter. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please send a chat message to the host. To submit questions for the Q&A portion of the call, please send a chat message to everyone during the call. Please note this call is being recorded and will be made available on the COMTO website, and we'd like to thank you for joining us. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our CEO, Brad Mims. Brad?
Yes, thank you, Gatwiri, and I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us this morning and this afternoon for this session, Leading Effectively Through Crisis. And this is being done by my good friend Rondalyn Kane. And Rondalyn and I have been colleagues for, I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to say.
Yes, please.
We've been colleagues for a long, long time. We go back to our days when we were young people on Capitol Hill, young staff people on Capitol Hill. I know that I've been working, serving through the administration. Rondalyn has been with the State Department, which she recently retired from, Booz Allen Hamilton, and other entities. But she's always been a wealth of knowledge and has been one who's been on the front lines in dealing with a plethora of issues as we go forward. So I'd like to introduce Rondalyn Kane, and with that, Rondalyn, you want to go ahead and take it and just give everyone a little background about yourself more than I have here, if you will.
All right. Thank you, Brad. Thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me to join you guys today and to talk about an issue that I'm passionate about. As Brad has said, we've known each other for many, many years. And the one thing that has been consistent in our conversations is our talk about effective leaders. We worked on Capitol Hill together, worked with a lot of leaders. I have been interested in leadership since probably high school. I looked at the civil rights movement and the leaders in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, and then when we worked on the Hill, we worked on the anti-apartheid movement. And what always fascinated me was how could one or two people get legions of folks to galvanize behind their vision and work towards implementing that vision. And I worked on Capitol Hill to kind of figure that out because I wanted to be with people who were doing it. And after working on in politics for about 18 years, in the year 2000, I left politics altogether and decided to study leadership. So since that time, I've been studying leadership. I went to Georgetown and got certified in organizational development and transformational leadership. I worked at Booz Allen. I'm a certified coach. I've taught senior executives in the private sector and in government. And always my passion has been, who are those leaders who are most effective and what are they doing to effectuate change? And then who are the leaders who are less successful and what are they doing that is undermining their success? So today we're going to talk about leading effectively through a crisis. I can see the chat box. I can't see everybody's faces. So there will be times when I'm going to ask for people to raise their hand to participate. Dante will handle that for me. I like, thanks Dante. I like participant engagement. So I have designed this so that there will be times when I ask you questions and tell you to put your answers in the chat box. There will be times when I ask you to raise your hand and then Dante would facilitate my getting those questions or answers. And then there will be times when, especially when we're looking at development areas of your own, that I ask that you just jot down your answers privately to yourself and you can review that after the session is done. I am going to try and finish between 12:45 and 12:50, but I am amenable to staying later if folks have questions that they want to ask of me. So, Gatwiri, if you would advance the slide, I want to start with this question. So, we're talking about leading effectively through crises. I want to hear, when you hear the word crisis, what comes to mind for you? And you can drop your answers in the chat box. Just, you hear the word crisis, your leader, what comes to mind for you?
Like someone said, trouble, someone who facilitates change. Yeah, they're coming in.
Okay, unusual situations, especially that we have bad things. Okay.
Extreme and immediate difficulty or challenges. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so I'm seeing someone who facilitates change, extreme and immediate difficulty or challenge, and unusual situations, especially that have bad things going on. If you would advance the slide for me, Dante, please. I mean, Gatwiri. So here are some synonyms for crises. They're all negative. Disaster, catastrophe, emergency, calamity. All of these are negative. But what else could be true in the face of crises? And that is more of a rhetorical question because I'm about to tell you what else could be true. Gatwiri, if you would advance the slide for me, please. Opportunity. Opportunity is also available in the face of crises. And effective leaders understand that. They understand, yeah, the bad stuff is going on and we've got to take care of it. But also there is an opportunity to do our business, our work differently. And when you think about opportunity, I'd like you to think about it kind of in three categories. So there is an opportunity to review. That is to review, how did we get here in the first place? What happened? Were there things that we could have mitigated? Were there things that we didn't see coming? Were there things that we couldn't have foreseen? But what you want to do is you want to do a review, okay? The next thing that you want to do is, in light of this crisis or emergency or challenge that you're facing, you want to reset. Because you can't do everything that you were doing under good times, right? So you want to think about, well, what are some things that we need to stop doing? So for example, this pandemic, we had to stop coming into the office. People had to stop doing that. What are things that we had to continue doing? Well, you all have to continue to serve your membership. You've got to get information to them. You've got to be available to answer their questions. Whatever services you provide, you've got to continue doing that despite this pandemic or this crisis we find ourselves facing. And the third thing that you can do, and I think this is the thing that most distinguishes good leaders from great leaders, is great leaders in an emergency or in a crisis are also thinking about new possibilities. They are imagining new possibilities, and they're thinking not only how do I get through this crisis, but how do I transcend it and transform my organization so that it is something even more powerful as we move along, okay, as we move into the future. Gatwiri, will you advance the slide? So here are the objectives for our discussion today. First, I want to review the attributes of an effective leader. And the attributes answer the question, who am I being? Am I being courageous? Am I being ethical? Who am I being? The next objective is to identify best practices that effective leaders employ to get through a crisis. So one is, who am I being? And the other is, what am I doing? Okay. And the third objective is, I'd like for you to pinpoint your strengths, one strength, and an action, best practice, that you will take to effectively lead through a crisis or challenge that your organization is facing. So what I'd like for you to do now is to think about your organization, and it doesn't have to be a crisis. We can also use the term challenge, but something that your organization is facing, that you are a leader who's presiding over this challenge. I want you to write that down, a line or two. I'll give you a time, and that's writing it personally on paper for yourself. Okay. Periodically throughout our discussion, we'll come back to that challenge that you are facing, and we'll give you an opportunity to think about what is the strength that you possess that's going to get you through that crisis and help you transform your organization, and what is a best practice that you will employ to get through the crisis. Okay. Gatwiri, if you would advance for me, please. So these two resources are informing our discussion today. They are the book written by Daniel Goleman. It's called Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ, and a book written by Doris Kearns Goodwin, which is Leadership in Turbulent Times. The book written by Daniel Goleman, how many people have heard of this book? Just, can you do a show of hands? Like in Zoom, I can just see how many people, or is that something we can do, Dante, or no?
They would have to indicate it in the chat.
Okay,
but
it might be a little too complicated. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Daniel Goleman and a little bit about Doris Kearns Goodwin. Both are thought leaders as it relates to leadership. Daniel Goleman was a journalist in the 80s and early 90s, and he studied psychology. And he studied the psychology of social interaction. What made some people better at it than others? And how did that inform their leadership? Some people were better leaders than others because they had what he called emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is different than the intellectual IQ intelligence. And I'm going to give you a working definition in a minute. But Goleman said that those individuals who possessed high EQ or emotional intelligence were better leaders and were better able to influence people to follow them. And we'll talk about why in a minute. Darce Kearns Goodwin is a noted historian. She has studied American history. Specifically, she studies American presidents. So she has looked at their background, their values, their leadership styles, what made them effective, what got in the way. In her most recent book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, she studies the presidencies of Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And what she does is she looks at, their background, their values, where they came from, but she also looks at, they were at crucible moments in this country's history. And they are probably considered the 4 top presidents in the country so far. I mean, we don't know what other, what lies ahead, but they're considered up there. And they are considered leaders who effectively led this country through turbulent times. And so she studies in her work, what did they do that made them effective? And those will be my discussion of best practices. Her work will inform my discussion on best practices. Okay. So before, if Gatwiri would, yeah, thank you. So I want you to answer this question. You all have worked with leaders from throughout the world at this juncture. What were their attributes that made them effective leaders? How were they being that made them effective? Not what they were doing, but who were they being? Were they courageous? Were they ethical? I'd like you to post some of your responses in the chat, please. Like, who was that leader and who were they being that made them effective? Compassionate. Thank you, Andrea. Passionate, ethical, personable, thoughtful, sacrificial, caring, empathetic.
Credible.
Yeah. Any other attributes?
Fighting for the right thing.
Okay, thank you. You read for me, Dante.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Frequently the adults in the room help grow the individuals of the team. From AJ, Daryl said open to change. Alexander said working towards. Oh, he was correcting himself in his earlier message. Miss Joanna said trustworthy. Andrea said patient. So a lot of these answers in a lot of qualities for leaders as well.
Yes, thank you. So a lot of attributes. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what Daniel Goleman says makes an effective leader. And a lot of what you have said aligns very nicely with what he said. Gatwiri, would you advance the slide for me, please? So first, let me define emotional intelligence. And there is an academic version that's very wordy. I don't like to use it when I'm talking to leaders. I think it gets in the way of our discussions. So emotional intelligence basically consists of 2 things. Number 1, you recognize and understand and manage your own emotions. Very important. An effective leader does not allow emotions to hijack them. Okay. And the second thing that, the second attribute or component of emotional intelligence is that one recognizes, understands, and influences the emotions of others. So someone with high emotional intelligence has that capacity. They are compassionate. They are empathetic. They are patient. All of these things are traits that they possess. Gatwiri, if you would, please. So here are the 5 qualities of emotional intelligence, or EQ for short. I'm going to go over them fairly succinctly. And as I do, think about how what you wrote in the chat box aligns with what Goleman is saying. So the first thing Goleman says is an effective leader has emotional self-awareness. In order to lead effectively, you need to understand how your emotions affect other people. I know we have all worked with and for people who are not in touch with that. And they come into the office and everybody's in a great mood, and within 2 seconds the great mood has disintegrated because this person has come in and just brought everybody down. An effective leader is very aware of his or her mood and the effect it has on others. And particularly as you ascend in the hierarchy, you want to be aware of that, because the higher you go, the more nuanced your behavior has to be, or your way of being has to be. People are looking at you all day long, trying to read the tea leaves, and you may say a joke and they think you're serious and they respond to that in a different way. So you really have to understand who you are and how it affects others. Self-regulation. That is the ability to manage your emotions and not let them get the best of you, and to engage in practices that support your self-regulating. So people who self-regulate usually, take vacations, they have hobbies, they exercise, they maybe have a coach or someone like that they can confide in, who will help them get through whatever challenge they are confronting. I have a friend, who his 12-year-old son was diagnosed with cancer in September, but you would never know it the way he shows up at work. He is very positive and optimistic. He is sometimes sad, and people know that, but he regulates his sadness and he doesn't inflict it on other people. And consequently, he is seen as a leader in the organization, and his leadership is valued. Motivation, motivation is utilizing emotional factors to achieve goals, enjoying the learning process. If you are going through a challenge or a crisis, there are going to be hiccups along the way. And as a leader, you have to make sure that you motivate yourself and your team to get past those hiccups, to have them experience those hiccups as learning opportunities that they will build upon to meet the team's goal and vision, okay? Empathy, obviously, putting yourself in the shoes of other people. There has been a lot of conversation. I was kind of surprised by this too. There's been a lot of conversation in the newspapers about the lack of empathy of certain leaders in our country right now. And 20 years ago, I don't think that they talked about empathy as a leadership quality the way they talk about it now. But you have to have some empathy, put yourself in people's shoes in order to lead them through whatever crises the team is facing. And then finally, Goleman says an effective leader has outstanding social skills. The ability to read people, to understand what makes them tick, what gets them involved, what is a turnoff to them, when to push, when to lean back, All of these are important social skills that an effective leader has. Okay. He says people with higher EQs are better able to lead in good situations and bad situations because they have this emotional intelligence and because they don't allow themselves to have their emotions hijacked by a given event or moment in time. So I want to pause a minute to see, number one, do you have any questions about Goleman's model and the qualities of emotional intelligence?
Question that came in from Michael Boone. He asked, which of these do you think leaders struggle with most with regards to the 5 qualities of emotional intelligence that you have listed here?
That is a great question. I think that sometimes they struggle to show empathy because they're conflicted about seeming vulnerable to their population, to their, to the people who work with them. I think that is one that they struggle with. And the other is, I think sometimes they don't put enough emphasis on social skills. They can be social, but sometimes when they're in crisis, some leaders go in and narrow their focus, and you really need to spread your focus to include more people in the discussions. Was that helpful?
Thank you. And yes, and looks like we have another question from Dr. Neva Bandari. She asked, how do we evaluate emotional intelligence in a person?
How do you evaluate it in a person? So I've got 2 answers to that question. I think when you are on the outside, it is easy for you to see, this person doesn't, doesn't understand the effect that he is having on the group. That you can tell it that way. It usually shows up in the relationship. It usually shows up in relationship. There's a disconnect in relationship, and so you see that person is missing the mark somewhere. The other thing I want to say is that Goleman has an assessment instrument that will help leaders understand how they are showing up as leaders, what are their strengths, what are their challenges, and what can they do to compensate for the areas of development that where they're missing some of this. So as Joanna said that, asked how does one improve EQ in themselves? You can do this assessment instrument. Sometimes I think it's helpful to have a coach so that a coach can help you with that. If your organization does 360s, not for evaluation purposes, but for development purposes, then that's helpful. In the beginning, when 360s were created, 360 assessments where you get feedback from peers, direct reports, and your managers, those instruments were developed so that you could understand, I need to develop my network with my peers more. Here's what I need to do. Now what happens is people use them as an evaluation mechanism, and so folks who are on the receiving end of the feedback are more fearful and not as inclined to use the information for development purposes. Okay, so I'm going to move on because we don't have much time, but what I would ask you to do is, as you think about yourself and you think about the challenge that I asked you to write about in the beginning of the session, I want you to think, what is your strength? Of these 5 qualities, what do you think is your strength? Are you somebody who's seen as very composed and nonplussed? Then maybe self-regulation is what you do well. Are you someone who's seen as a good listener? Then maybe empathy is your strength. And then the other thing I want you to write, not only your strength, but what is an area of development with respect to these 5 qualities that might help you with your challenge? Would it help you, for example, to expand your social skills and to, instead of going in to solve a problem, opening up and involving other people in the resolution of the issue? Let me give you a moment to write your answers down to that. What is your strength? And what is an area you would develop to help you with your challenge? Okay. Good, Tweary, you can advance me for a second. Okay, you can advance another slide for me, please. Okay. All right. So we talked about the attributes, and some of the attributes that you all wrote aligned very nicely with Goldman's work: empathetic, patient, compassionate, including people in the team. All of those are ways of being that help a leader in his or her effectiveness. Now I want you to switch your thought process for a minute and think of behaviors or actions that an effective leader takes. So as you think about a leader that you worked with who got your organization through a crisis. What did they do that helped pull the team through that crisis? I'm gonna give you a minute, and if you would write that response in the chat box, that would be very helpful. Thank you, Scott. I'll have Dante read all of them in a minute here.
Sure. So Scott Crumley, he responded, he said the leader that he experienced was clear and frequent with communication.
Okay. Others, what actions did you see?
Michael Boone, he said his leaders were generous with time. Mm-hmm. Dr. Neva Bandari stated that her leaders communicated a lot more often. Okay. Sherry Sharps mentioned that her leaders came together, not just on emails. Andrea Manley stated that her leaders showed up and physically pitched in to help. So a lot of engagement. AJ, he stated that his leaders kept calm and composed and led clear and defined tasks, regularly reported the status of everything, similarly had open discussions with everyone to see how everyone was doing emotionally and workload, and had discussions to get engagement and buy-in from employees as well. That's a good answer. Yeah. And then let's see here, Mr. Don Gayton, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, Don. He also said that his leaders recognized the needs of others in the group and applied the right tool to the situation based on their needs.
Great. All great answers. And you will see that some of the answers, once again, you guys have great insight into what behaviors make a leader effective in crises and challenging times. I'm going to use the work of Doris Kearns Goodwin. If I don't want you to do the slide just yet. Let me just say a little bit about how her book is laid out. So the way her book is laid out is she talks about a particular incident in each presidency, in each of the individuals' presidency: Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Johnson. And then she walks you through everything that that president did to get the country through the crises, and then also to transform the way the nation did business. So remember, in the beginning of this, I said the opportunity is not just to address the crisis, the opportunity is also there to transcend it and to transform your organization. So I'm going to go through the some of the best practices that Kearns listed. She listed probably 15 to 20 for each individual. So what I did was categorize them and laid them out so that we can have a bit of a discussion about them. So Katwiri, if you would, hit me again. Thank you. Do me again. Okay, good. Thank you. I was playing with PowerPoint. Obviously, I'm still learning the fine points of PowerPoint. So here are her 6 of the best practices. First, an effective leader has the self-awareness that Goldman talked about, but also practices self-care. Okay, so it is probably human nature to have an adrenaline rush and be consumed with whatever matter of urgency is in front of you. And all 4 of the presidents that she talked about practiced self-care. They took themselves away from the event so that they could think, reflect, get in touch with their values, and rejuvenate themselves to handle this big crisis that was in front of them. The one thing I forgot to say, and I want to say now, is even though she is talking about best practices that Lincoln employed 155 years ago, and Johnson was like 40 something years ago, these best practices are timeless for a leader, and that's why I included them in here. So when I go through, I'm going to talk about how she laid it out in the book, and then a modern example so you can see that it's still relevant. So in terms of self-care, Theodore Roosevelt and Lincoln both had times where they would go away. Lincoln especially, when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, he did it in the spring of 1863, I think. He didn't release it until the fall of 1863. He wrote it, he socialized it with his cabinet, got feedback, but then he went out of DC for the summer, which was not uncommon then, and he read tons of books, and he really got himself physically ready to deal with the rigors of leadership. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what came out of his being in seclusion like that. Modern day examples: Obama would routinely go to Hawaii for Christmas, Martha's Vineyard in the summer. He would take tons of books with him. He would play golf. He would read basketball. All these things are ways in which you practice self-care. Build relations before you need them. So Goldman talked about social skills. All of the people in this book built an extensive network for themselves. I was impressed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He would hold, before he even thought about running for president, it was not even on his radar screen, he would have people come to his home for dinner. He would have like 20, 25 people come to his home for dinner, and they would talk about the issues of the day, and he would invite all kinds of thought leaders. When he after he got polio, that was especially important because he couldn't get out to the public. So he had to count on people to bring him that information. You build those relationships before you need them. A modern example is President Clinton. When he used to have the Renaissance weekends and policy wonks would come from all over the country and the world, he was building a network. And smart leaders not only build their networks, but they create opportunities for the people who are in their network to network, because that all accrues to him or her in the end. Another best practice is to do your research. Hillary Clinton read copiously. Obama, the same thing. Bill Clinton, the same thing. Lincoln did a lot of research. You have to research, you have to know your topic. The other thing I will say about research that Theodore Roosevelt did, which was really interesting, is he went outside of his circle. So when he was a state senator, there was legislation about housing for factory workers. And the landlords, who were of Theodore Roosevelt's economic class, were saying, oh no, we take care of them, they're fine, no need to do legislation. Theodore Roosevelt one night went down to those places and saw the deplorable conditions people were living in. So do your research, go outside of your network to do that research, be innovative in your research. Tell the story, not the stats. So it's nothing more boring than somebody sitting there, dumping all these statistics on you. When I look at, and it's not effective. So when you think about, and this is graphic, I'm sorry to use this example, but it makes the point. We've been hearing statistics about police brutality for years. But when you see the story of how it affected one man or several men or men and women, it takes on a whole different component. So you want to be able to tell the story that will back up your statistics, okay? There are courses available for people to take storytelling, to learn storytelling. I think it is a great tool for leaders to look into. And it doesn't have to be, a semester. It could be, 3 or 4 hours. It's worth it. Be bold and be willing to depart from the past. So when Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office, he didn't even go to the inaugural festivities. He shut down the, he and his cabinet met. They shut down the banks for 5 days, which was unprecedented, and came up with legislation on how they were going to save the banking industry and consequently the economy of the United States. You want to be bold like that. When I think about a bold leader, and today I think about Jose Andres, the restaurateur who went to Puerto Rico and said, the American government might not be able to feed you, and the Puerto Rican government may not be able to feed you, but I'm going to feed you. And he fed 1.5 million people. He provided 1.5 million meals, for people on that island after the hurricane. That's bold. And that's what you want to be. You want to just think outside the box. Any questions about these best practices before I move to the last 5? Okay. All right. Because I am aware of time. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat box and we'll come back to them. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on. Next best practice is thank you, Gatwiri, be transformational as well as transactional. A transformational leader establishes a big, bold vision for the organization, and it usually takes years and years, if not decades, for the organization to achieve it. One of the preeminent transformational messages that we use when we're teaching leadership development is Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. That's transformational leadership. But you also have to be transactional. Sometimes you got to use the carrot and the stick to bring people along. Lyndon Johnson was famous for that. So he would do horse trading in the legislature to get what he wanted and to give other people what they wanted. He also would say, you know, with the Civil Rights Bill, Chairman Howard Smith of the House Rules Committee didn't want to consider civil rights legislation. He said, Howard, you can bring it in the committee and do it the right way, or I'll go behind your back, use a discharge position, and you will seem disempowered. You want to be able sometime to go a little gangster on people if you have to, if that's what's necessary. Assess, adjust, and sometimes abandon a strategy. Lincoln did that with the Emancipation Proclamation. When he came into office, his original strategy was slaves could be in the South, there wouldn't be no slavery in the North, and the border states could decide. After a year or so of war, Lincoln said, this isn't working because the South was using the slaves to maintain its economic power and they were kicking butt militarily. He's like, I got to change this whole thing. So guess what, South? We're abolishing slavery throughout the country. It alienated some of his allies. It created a lot of dissension, but it also was effective in keeping people on point of this is what a union will look like. One of the first answers you all said was communicate. You've got to communicate, communicate, communicate. You have to communicate up, down, out. It's got to be accurate. It's got to be consistent. It's got to be honest. It's got to be updated. A modern example is Andrew Cuomo. Throughout the pandemic, he kept people updated on a daily basis. It was real, factual information, and he treated people with respect. Like they are intelligent, they can make sense of this data. Share the glory and lose graciously. As a leader, if you bring folks through this crisis, if you bring them to a new state of being and transform the organization, there is plenty of credit to go around. So very important to share the glory, to also be a gracious loser. We don't often see that these days, but there are leaders who did that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not want FDIC insurance in his legislation. House and Senate leaders said, you gotta have it or the bill is not gonna pass. Ultimately, Roosevelt acquiesced, and it was the one part of the bill that the American people really bought into. It basically was saying, we're insuring your bank savings for $250,000. And that's what made American people go back and put their money back in the bank when they had been pulling it out of the bank. And be courageous. In other words, the buck stops with you. So, you know, sometimes as leaders, your rear end is on the line. Johnson, in order to get what his vision of the Great Society implemented, he wanted civil rights legislation to be enacted and passed. And yet, being from the South, he knew how contentious that issue was, and he knew that potentially it could cost him the presidency. Lincoln had the same challenge with the Emancipation Proclamation, yet both of them felt that this was the best thing to do in the interest of the country, and they did it. And they both transformed this country and its relationship with its people. It is not perfect by any means, but it was far less perfect before they took the actions that they took. So I want to ask, does anybody have questions about the best practices that I have shared? Do you have any best practices of your own that weren't listed here that you think might be helpful? Okay, it looks like we can move on. So here is my next request. Gatwiri, if you would advance the slide for me. I want to ask you, what is one, as you think about the challenge or crises that you wrote about early today, what is one action or best practice that you can employ that will allow you to effectively lead your organization through that crisis? Take a minute to write that down.
Oh, Michelle Hyatt, she said pray and encourage corporate prayer.
Okay.
Tamika Monterville said that being vulnerable, even when it is uncomfortable. That's a really good point.
Yeah, you have to be strategic in your vulnerability. You use it to encourage and motivate people because they want their leaders to be strong. So it is, how do you use it in service to meeting the goal? But I appreciate that, Tamika. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it looks like Melissa Roscott, she also added that to continue to communicate effectively with the team while showing compassion.
Okay, all right, thank you. So I have one last question of you, and you can unmute your mic to share your response to this, and then I'll wrap up the discussion for today. But as you think about your challenge and what you can do to move past it and to lead past it, if somebody wouldn't mind sharing what they're thinking about doing differently now, I think it would be helpful for us to hear.
If you would like to speak verbally or chime in, feel free to type hand raised in the chat, and I will ask if you could unmute your mic so you can speak.
Okay, well, I understand, because I did say that they were private, but sometimes people like to share what they're going to do differently. Empathy that roots toward doing the right thing. Okay. Thank you, Alexander. Anybody else? Well, my time is up, so I'm going to wrap up the conversation by saying, number one, thank you for having me present today. I'm really honored to be one of your speakers. The other thing is, I just feel like now is a time for different visions, different leadership visions to be employed and different voices to be heard. And I hope that yours is one of those visions and voices that will be heard. The world needs people like you. And part of the reason I got into this work is because I see so many tremendous people out here who are leaders who are not being heard. And anything that I can do to support them, I am interested in doing. Okay, so I'm seeing folks are now chatting some. So Dante, if you would want to, if you share the chat, then I will close out with my contact information.
Sure, no problem. So it looks like we have a comment from Andrea Manley. She said, thank you for this. This gives me lots to think about. Michelle Hyatt, she says amen. Adams Sharon from Transit Museum, she said, I'm having problems. Oh, hearing the presentation. Okay. So the presentation will be recorded, everyone, and it will be on our website for view if you are having trouble. But this will be recorded, and it is being recorded. It will be posted on our site. Don Gateson, he said one quick thing. In our new virtual meeting world, intense listening is very, very important. Very true.
Absolutely.
Michael Boone and Alexander, they also thanked you as well. And Dr. Neva Bandari says, thanks, the session was good and enlightening and fun as well.
Great.
And actually, Ms. Rondalyn, I actually have one quick question.
Okay.
So it's actually two. So in your opinion, which is more imperative, or both, leading others through a crisis or the crisis itself? And then my second question was, leaders encounter and manage various personalities on the daily basis. How would that affect how they lead those personalities through a crisis?
Okay. So which is more, the first one is, which is more important, the crisis or leading through it?
Yes, or both.
Well, so you've got to resolve the crisis. I mean, you can't transform the organization unless you clean that up. So you got to resolve it, and your leadership helps to resolve it. What was the second piece? How do you deal with the different personalities? So there are volumes of works devoted to that question, Dante. But what I will say is, one of the ways I do it as a leader is I think, what does the situation require? Not what do I want, but what does this situation require to be resolved? So it may mean that I have to put aside my personal agenda to make sure that the vision is executed. My focal point is always the vision. And if I have personalities that are different, I try to align them to the vision. Like, here's where you fit with the vision, and here's what you can add. Okay.
That's a really good answer. I never thought about it that way. I was thinking of these questions as you were presenting, so I thank you for answering those for me.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us on this webinar today. And I'm sure the rest of our COMTO national staff and Brad Mims can speak on this as well. We greatly appreciate it, Rondalyn. We thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. My contact information is on the last slide. So if folks want to get in touch with me, I'm always interested in getting in hearing what is keeping you up at night as a leader, because I would like to develop more courses and seminars around that topic. So please feel free to send me your emails. Okay, well, that's it for me. I'm going to let you guys close out. Thank you, COMTO. I appreciate that.
No problem. And thank you, Rondalyn. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Katweri.
Thank you, Rondalyn, and thank you, Dante, for assisting with the chat and the discussion. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you once again to Brad Mims, who gave our opening remarks. Just to let you know that a follow-up email with a link to the recording, as well as a survey, because we want to get your feedback on how Rondalyn did. And it looks like everyone really enjoyed this presentation, so be on the lookout for that. And in July and August, we have several webinars coming up. So look for News in Motion, look for your email invitations, and also check out our calendar on COMTOnational.org, where you can find this information, and continue to join us. We hope that these webinars that you found useful. If you have suggestions for other webinars and topics, feel free. If you're a great presenter and you have a great topic you'd like to present on, we're always open to that as well. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again. Thank you, Rondalyn. Thank you, Dante. And thank you once again. And everyone, please enjoy the rest of your day, weekend, and then the 4th of July holiday, which is coming up. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Everybody. Bye-bye.